guys, so here it is, a Land Cruiser 200 series. This particular one runs the dual starting batteries, which you'll see here. There's the main starting battery, and then these run a second cranking battery, going to a single cranking battery, which the later model 200 series uses, and then utilizing the second one as an auxiliary battery. So in this case, we're going to retain both batteries because these two batteries are quite large Century batteries, but it's usually advisable to change one, in this case, which will be this auxiliary side on the driver's side, to a deep cycle battery, which is going to be a better way to run that that fridge point in the back. Batteries changed only a few months ago, so they're practically brand new. He won't be using the auxiliary point to run his fridge full time. It's literally just going to be in there to run on things like day trips and that sort of stuff. So for the time being, he wants to stick with the secondary battery that's already in here. We have the Redarc BCDC1225D charger. This is basically the isolator as well as a charger to charge the auxiliary battery. We use for these generally an ARB BCDC mounting bracket, which goes in the front of the car behind the grille. Again, I'll show you very shortly once we get into installing it where that goes. I largely use this one because ARB makes some fantastic products. You can see how nicely put together that is anyway. Comes with this cover plate. You'll see why this is important shortly. The last part of the job is these little fittings here. We've got 3 Anderson plugs. We're using these as a fridge point, we're using these as a solar input and also the output on the back of the car. We use MIDI fuse holders. And then the final thing that I like to use with these is a 50 amp circuit breaker. We need to pull out this top radiator cover. You've got to take out these push clips. These push down and then release to be popped back up. We've got our main starting battery here, which you can see is an 810 CCA battery, so very, very strong starting battery. And because it's been replaced from what was here originally, more than enough cold cranking amps to turn over this Toyota V8 turbo diesel. The part we're going to work on today is going to be this cable here. So this cable, which runs across, you can see just straight links the two batteries together. And what we're going to be doing is taking that cable out and replacing it with our charger. Okay, so this is the process now of removing the link cable from the center of the engine bay there. We have to get all of our nuts and bolts ready to put our BCDC charger onto the ARB mounting bracket. So there's 4 bolts that hold that together. We torque them down. Once that's all mounted up, come back here to the car. We mount our solar Anderson plug on the side of this bracket. So you can see it's shortened, terminated, crimped, soldered, ready to go. We use heat shrink on that to show that that's a positive side, so red heat shrink of course. Then we'll do an earth on it on the same side, tethered on. So the earth for the solar and also the earth for the BCDC will be put to the same spot. Crimp it, solder it, cover it with heat shrink. Okay, now we're going to shorten up our trigger wires. With this 200 series, we don't need use of any of the trigger wires. Sometimes you need them for ignition turn on. We've cleaned up our earth point there at the front radiator support panel. Removed the horn so we can locate this new bracket. Obviously replace the horn back on. We've got our earth point there. It's all these tightened up, back up to spec. So now that's ready to go.
Next step in the process is to bring our two feed wires out. So in this case we've got our red as our input from the battery, or the starting battery. So it's essentially our alternator feed into the charger. The brown is then the output. So it's going to be outputting our charge to our auxiliary battery. This is how this works as an isolator as well as a charger. To bring that cable through from the charger to the auxiliary battery, put a terminal on the end of it so it can link onto the battery itself. We'll have a MIDI fuse in the middle. So we've done the same process: crimp, soldered, heat shrink, split convoluted tubing, attach it to the MIDI fuse. MIDI fuse is attached, and the cover goes back on over the top. On the feed side, or the starting battery side, it's the same process. Cable runs across, it's terminated with a crimp terminal, a ring terminal, that's soldered, that's heat shrunk, MIDI fuse again. The ARB kit comes with a mount for the MIDI fuse that sits up there on top of the bracket for the battery. So that is easily accessible. Just make a little link cable to join the MIDI fuse holder to the main starting battery there.
Okay, so we can see our BCDC1225D, which is now mounted on the ARB bracket I showed you earlier. We have the solar input wired in there also now ready to go. We've got our cabling, which is all neatly done with split tubing and heat shrink, because this motor is off, that the charge profile is just flashing as A. There's nothing on there, which means the charger is off. Now we fire up our vehicle. This one, push button start. Vehicle start. It's running up to about 14.6 volts, while the initial battery, or the starting battery, is sitting well below 14. So we switch the car off here, guys. See, the engine stopped, and you'll notice, at least to begin with, that it's still charging at the moment. This means that the resting voltage of our start battery is quite good, and because we haven't fully drained the battery below the cutoff point for this charger, it means that it's now still supplying some charge over to this big battery on this side. So that's it as far as the isolation part of the charger goes. I'm happy with the way that it's working and that it's come together. It's, as I said at the beginning, it's fused on both ends, so it's now solidly good to go. What's happening with the engine and the alternator, the auxiliary battery is actually charging at a higher rate. But if you've got a fridge, and particularly a fridge freezer or a standalone freezer, which is going to require a lot more energy to keep the items inside cold for longer, that auxiliary battery is sitting at a really high rate. I'll run you through the last component, which is now then running the cabling through to the back, and then where we're terminating it with the Anderson plug.
Alright, so for the process of putting in the power that runs to the back, we have our circuit breaker that's going in. This is a 50 amp self-resetting circuit breaker. We'll cover some more info on that later. It's a repeat of the process from before, so we've got a linking cable with our crimp and soldered terminal on the end of it. It's going to link that battery across to the circuit breaker, which you can see there we mounted on the far side, on the left hand side looking from this angle. Our cable that runs to the back is then also tightened on. These use a nut and bolt to hold them together so they don't rattle loose. We feed our cable here down in underneath where the factory cabling runs on the side here. So it tucks in underneath where the brake booster is. It follows along closely to where the brake lines run onto the chassis. You can see here at the bottom that the cable comes down from up the top. It's all split tubed all the way through. We feed a cable runner through the chassis rail from front to back, and we pull our cable through with it neatly tied off so it doesn't get caught on bush or anything that might foul underneath the car. Last part in this process is feeding up the cable from below, which is going to go up through into the passenger area in the boot, and that's going to be for our internal vehicle Anderson. This cable is going to run across to the passenger side. It's going to give us the option of running the Andersons both here at the back of the car next to the factory 7-pin, or also in the car to have a fridge for our day trips and our camping, or even if we need to run something small like an air compressor or whatever and want to run it inside the car. This shows that joint between the two Anderson plugs. It's essentially like a loop in this case, rather than running a separate circuit for each one. Everything's neatly, tidily put away, obviously protected from the elements. We'll make up a little earth loop for our Anderson plug here as well. Tube it, heat shrink, crimp terminals, feed it into the Anderson plug, lock it in place, lock the power in place, mount the Anderson plug here on the back right next to where the 7-pin is on the factory mount. And there's a bolt there for the factory mount at the top, which we've already pre-cleaned up, and that's now in place for the earth for that rear Anderson plug. A few cable ties just to neaten it up, keep everything out of harm's way. That's the finished product on the back. Inside the car, we're feeding our cable across, as I mentioned before, to the passenger side. We're feeding our cable in, and we're going to mount this Anderson plug just below the factory 240 volt 100 watt output that's there. So same process, Anderson crimps, feed them through, solder it on, clip them into place, feed the heat shrink through. Same thing with the earth, feed it through, clip it in. Ring terminal on that ready to go. There's a factory earth in just behind this panel. So we've now checked for depth, we're all good. We're mounting our Anderson plug there with some nuts and bolts. We've got our factory earth point here, which we're hooking our Anderson up to. Panel goes back in, tighten it up. All the pieces go back in. And finally this protector.
In this particular case, we can get away with just running the one cable, the one circuit breaker. If we needed a higher amperage output on our caravan, or if we were planning on having a fridge, for example, running 24/7 in the back of this car, I would probably run 2 separate circuits or 2 separate setups for that. But in this case, there was no real need for it. And it means that we can keep the budget in check for the customer as well. The final piece of this puzzle is just putting together the cover for the BCDC that goes just down here in below. So the cover will sit over this part, and it'll be modified so that that factory piece will go back in, and you'll have just your little metal piece here at the top. Does it fit? Beautiful. I'll give you guys a close-up. Okay, so there it is. That's the close-up view. You can see how it sits in the front there, and it's really a nice fit. So that's it. Land Cruiser 200 series is now finished. These 200 series, they're a really good option because there's so many parts available for them. As you can see with the way that this one comes together with that BCDC bracket in particular, it's a really, really neat and tidy finish that is as close to kind of a factory finish as you would get with something like this. Until next time, guys, keep an eye on our social pages. Follow us along at CanFitACT through Facebook and also through Instagram. Make sure you subscribe and like our stuff here on YouTube as well. Here is where you'll find some of the more in-depth videos. You'll find some of the how-to stuff that's coming through, and also some of the larger build stuff that doesn't necessarily make it to the short format videos that you see on Instagram and Facebook. So until next time, guys, my name is Zach. Thank you for watching, and I will speak to you again soon.